Cool. How was lunch? All right. Should we try that again? Or was it just rubbish? How was lunch? Excellent. All right. So we're holding Chris up a little bit. Very excited about his talk. However, we have to get through a little bit of fun first. My glamorous assistant here, Nat. Say hello to Nat. So, you know we have sponsors and they all send swag, and on the way out you're going to get a bag full of all sorts of goodies. However, Nokia, especially Jared, decided to screw us over by sending, instead of sending 100 things, they just sent 8 bags. So now we're going to roulette them. Roll the dice. Grant Ashton, where are you?
I think he's gone.
He's gone home. Spin it again. Daniel Finneran. He's also gone. This might take a while.
That's cheating.
Where's Jason? All right, someone pass that all the way back down to Jason.
Next one.
Next one. Andrew. Yeah, there we go. I might go for the throw. Watch out. Look at that. All right, up next. Frank Tonjes. There you are. Good. Rob Blake. Oh, sorry, sir. Nearly. we have insurance, right? Okay. Let's go. Luke Richardson. That's an easy one. You can pass it to somebody else. What do we got? 4 to go. Simon. There you are.
Jesus Christ.
Sorry, I keep almost hitting you on the head. Sorry, it's not personal. Leonardo Almeida. There you are. Go down the middle. Underhand. Boom. Alex Gittings. He's still here. You can just pass it along. And Daniel from Barclays. There you are, sir. No more risk. This guy's too big. I don't want to. All right, very good. So this is the longest stretch of the day, right? 3 talks in a row and then a break. So 3 talks, then a break, then 2 talks, and then beers. We're trying to figure out how to do a little surprise last-minute thing, but we don't know where to put it. So more news on that soon. In the meantime, I'd like to introduce Chris. While Chris is getting set up, Chris from Itential. Itential is one of the incredible sponsors, so I'd like us to give another round of applause for the sponsors. Hold. I wrote them down. Equinix, Evolver, IP Fabric, Itential, NetBox Labs, Network to Code, NextPacket, and Nokia. Big round of applause, please. Ready?
Always.
Take it away, sir.
Mic check. We're good? All right, awesome. So my name's Chris Wade. I'm the CTO with Itential. I appreciate everybody being here. So for today, my talk is on evolving from individual automation to team automation. So we've talked a lot about tooling this morning. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the other components that we think are important as we get there. As far as agenda, I put the team on a little bit of ice back there, so I asked that we have the mics hot the whole time. So, number one reason we're here is to promote NetDevOps Days. It's the first one. I've been looking forward for years for a forum like this. It seems like it's always a part of a larger show. So I'm super excited about helping drive this forward. So I think this room needs to drive the discussion. So I'd really like to yield a lot of my time towards discussion. I'd like to use my time that way. So instead of questions at the end, I would like you guys to interrupt me throughout. So I'd appreciate that. And in this deck, I'm going to propose a few ideas. We have some strong opinions. Hopefully I ask more questions than provide answers. So a couple provocative things, and then I would love to have some debate. So please jump in. And if anybody just raises their hand, we'll try to get to a mic to you. So kind of what's the point here? So when we think about why we automate the network, I'm going to talk a little bit about like what it means for us. But ultimately, we're trying to improve the agility of the business. We've talked about cloud this morning. I think the cloud operating model is a high bar. But really about how do we improve the agility of the business? we haven't talked about security much, but a real big focus for our customers is really about how do we prepare the infrastructure for that security versus responding to it. And then we put I like to put our application developers at the forefront. So we'll talk about a bit about that today, and really about how do we have application teams drive network infrastructure, and how do we expose APIs so they can do so. And then obviously delivering resiliency for outages and partner disruptions. So as we build these things, this really makes me feel like we're in London. This is nice. So from an operational paradigm, how have we been doing network automation? The CLI was built for humans. If you've heard me speak before, I don't rail on this, but this is the source of a lot of our friction and frustration, is the sense that we have to build automation on top of an interface that was built for humans, right? And when we started doing this in 2014, the exciting part was programmability. Jason talked about SDN in the early days. We see it in controllers and cloud stuff today. And a lot of times we continue to try to fit those concepts into our existing mental model that we've built around scripting and modeling of infrastructure. We can talk a bit about what's happened in the telco world with inventory. They've gone down that path for the last 20 years, so I think there's a lot to be learned there. I think in general we struggle with collaboration. We build software. Code reviews and merge requests aren't necessarily the best collaborative mechanism. Either put it in production or don't. Refuse it for me. So I think as a group, figuring out how do we collaborate in more meaningful ways is very important. And when we look at testing and validation, historically code coverage is quite limited. So when we talk about infrastructure as code we'll get into, I think we need to challenge ourselves about what is the operational paradigm. How do we embrace some of the cloud operating model, and how do we move forward with our challenges ahead? And the question I'm going to pose as we get into this is what would it take for you guys to let somebody else run your automations? So I run my automations. I know what they do. I know where they're at. I know how to handle the errors. I mean, Peter talked this morning about the Ansible playbook that he had set up ideally. If something happened, he probably knew exactly how to handle it. A question I ask people all the time, and I won't do too much audience participation, but I always ask, would you share your script with the person in your team? And I say almost all the time, somebody says yes. Like, I know that person, I trust that person, we work together, they know the intricacies of the job, they understand what happens when something goes wrong. If I pose the question, would you share that with somebody in the app team or somebody at your company you don't know? Can I get one show of hands? This is the only time I'll do this. How many people will share their scripts with people they don't know in their organization?
To look at it or to run it?
To run it, execute it. To run it just like it would. Okay, so that's good. Probably 10, 15%. I think that's probably good. But the excuses I usually get are they don't understand networks. They don't understand what the byproduct of this is. But if we want our app dev teams to consume infrastructure on demand in a self-serve manner, the idea is, what do we need to do to our scripts? What do we need to do to our applications so that we have the confidence to allow people to do so? And I think that mental model change drives, I have to test it more, I have to make sure there's passwords, I got to use secrets. You have to do all these kind of more robust concepts. But the minute we can start having self-serve networking, we kind of leave our current operational paradigm and think about how we can effectively support the business in a more meaningful way. So we do look at automation as a team sport. So we tend to focus on our personal toil. A customer of ours says, destroy boring work. We tend to like that. I have to get my work done, and a lot of times there's a goal to become a software developer. That's like a skill gap, as Jason alluded to, that's very interesting. A lot of times when we're solving our problems, we ignore the complexity that might exist if I'm going to move more towards a self-serve model. So I'll start with what I know. Something's a little bit different, so instead of modifying what I have that already works, maybe I'd make a copy of it. I'm sure we have never done that before. Integrate with systems is too complicated. IT makes it too hard to get stuff done. I don't have permissions to those systems, et cetera, et cetera. So when we look at kind of a maturity model, which is the purpose of my time, is really thinking about what stage are we at? what stage would be beneficial to my organization and what stage would be beneficial to my team. So, the first one is limited or no automation. Anytime somebody says this, I challenge it. Obviously, nobody in this room is in this stage, but everybody has some scripts. Everybody is doing some automation. Nobody's doing just complete hand jam CLI anymore. But when we get to task automation, I think that's where we spend a lot of the time. This is me doing automation for myself so that I can be more effective. I would challenge how beneficial this is to the entire organization or the company. So I can get more work done. But a lot of times, if the business is requesting a firewall change or a load balancer change, it might still take 5 days. But I'm using my scripts and my automation to do that. But I still have to swivel chair between ticketing systems. I might have to swivel chair between other IT systems. When we start talking about workflow and orchestration, this is really tying my tasks together as an end-to-end outcome, right? So this is where I start to drive time out of my automation and my orchestration. So how do I shrink the time? How do I make it, instead of 5 days, how do I make it 5 minutes? Instead of 4 hours, how do I make it 5 seconds? So this really requires us to think about more than just pushing commands to the device and the interface, but this is really how do we tie our end-to-end IT systems together, which incorporates the end-to-end concept of orchestrating the system. And once you start peeling this back, and once you start thinking about all the systems involved, if I'm going to do end-to-end without any swivel chair, without any humans involved, it typically is more systems than we originally think. And we think the goal is to, we talk about platform engineering a bit, but really the concept is how do we do self-serve networking? What would be the benefit if our end users could consume our automation on demand? How would that change ticketing? How would that change requests? How would that change how the business looks at infrastructure? I think AWS has taught us that if you put it as self-service and you make it easy, people use it more. I think it's surprising to a lot of people that once we do self-service, you actually see people use the network more. And we've seen DNS requests, firewall requests go up 2-3-fold, and that might freak us out a bit. But if people are using the infrastructure more, they're getting more value from it, right? So if you look at changes to the network as driving value for the business, if we can do more of that within the same time, we're actually gaining a lot more value from our existing infrastructure. And if we look at the typical benefits, we try to split it out between what's the benefit to the infrastructure team and what's the benefit to the end user. But if I had to put a ticket in to get my AWS VPC turned up, it would change my mental model about how I would do that. So it's really about driving that expanded customer experience as we get into self-serve networking. So no interruptions so far. So, okay. So where do I start? A debate from this morning, so maybe spend less time on this, but we do see a large rotation, I would say, from kind of the Ansible Terraform, which is used profoundly across the industry, to thinking about how do I use more native constructs. I talk about the cloud model a lot, but if you look at AWS, we've moved from CloudFormation to dominated by Terraform to now CDK. So we've moved from programming through templates to doing infrastructure as code to doing infrastructure in code. And we see that paradigm moving. So I think this is generally where we start. I put it up there, but I generally have a complex relationship with Python. One of our tools, our platforms, is built out of Python. A lot of times we put Django or Flask on top of it, and we think that's kind of transformed what our scripts are. But Python being both a scripting language and a programming language, I think as a group we have a lot of thinking to do about what Python means for us and our organizations. If we look at something I talk about a lot, like Arista-validated designs, the question is it Ansible, is it Python? And ultimately, it's an application that it's made up of both Ansible and Python, right? Requires specific versions, pinned, Python, et cetera. So the question is, how do we think differently about migrating from scripts to Python applications? And how do I tie that together within my orchestration and automation strategy? So, running automations. So what data do I need for automations? So we talked a bit about the process, but typically I need resource availability. I need some IPAM, we've talked about that today. I need some way to execute it. I need my inventory for my execution. I need some password and token management. But I think in general, as an industry, we underestimate the data that's involved in our automation. A lot of the discussions today is how do we more robustly store that data? When we talk about sharing my automations, so whether it's with somebody else in my team or somebody else in the organization that don't understand, the question is what else do I need to do? So now I need authentication and authorization. Now I need to think about logging and auditing. We talked about all the forms and inputs. We need to make sure the data that people are interacting with me is accurate and robust and valid before I put it to the network. Probably using secrets management now, probably not embedding any passwords. I need more testing, and then when I get to the other side, I need potentially single sign-on. We talked about change management, ticketing, historical reporting, and hopefully I only have one of these, right? So in most organizations, there's going to be multiple of these for whatever reason. So I would like to hear from folks as far as like, why do we not let app teams order our infrastructure directly? So I think that's a core tenet here. Maybe they don't know how to use our stuff. Maybe our infrastructure is too brittle. I'm not comfortable with how much testing I've done. Takers. Come on. We got two over here. Thank you to the first two. Break the seal.
Hello.
Cheers.
Yes, I understand the question is, what would it take, right? So if you want an answer for us, what is it? I think what's missing is consistency, right? So boundaries of consistency. What does it take in order to reserve resources, right? Because self-service means very often to reserve resources in the network. Is a VLAN ID taken? What happens if two people at the same time request the same VLAN ID and you're halfway to two scripts which compete for that ID, for example, right? So I think much of network automation I find out is about consistency and how to make that right.
Fair enough. I think a lot of people in the room would say they're doing VLAN checkouts. So if we have that in place, what would be the next reason? Anybody else? Got next to you and then up front.
In my experience, it's usually every request is a Snowflake. So error handling and exception handling is probably on the scripting side is probably going to be the biggest blocker. Because if you're running the script or code and some request just is slightly out of bounds of whatever was written, or you don't have the right error checking, and the device errors out, then what?
Awesome.
So I think another thing is the limitations of a vendor product, where like we use Abstract AOS,
sure.
And you can have multiple people logged in at the same time, but the same problem, if you try and have 2 or 3 people apply a change, it can't magically add up what the delta is between the 2 scripts that run and then send it all into one, go and apply this configuration. So there's that. There's also another thing that we struggle with is sometimes things are constantly in development. So I'm in the network automation team, and we constantly, because you haven't tested it enough, initially you run it once, then you need to start learning to trust it. By the time you've trusted it, there's a new request that's come in that says, oh, we'd like to do this additional. So it's sort of constantly in developer mode, and getting it to production is like a goalpost that keeps moving. You never quite get to it because the demands will all be changed, type of thing. Sorry?
None of the problems that you described is to do with software. They're all to do with networking infrastructure. The problem that you're describing is the software development process, right?
Yeah, but the network's changing at the same time as the software.
Right. I think the question is more about why don't you let somebody run your software, not why don't you want them to configure the network.
So both are good. This is perfect. This is ideal.
That's kind of the point I'm making, though. Like, you need to be comfortable with your software failing.
Yeah.
Right? And then if it causes a catastrophic event on your network, then that's a thing for your software, not for the network, right?
Yeah, a lot of times we're learning as well. I mean, I'm not a networking person. I used to be. I've kind of evolved into an automation programmer, like with Python. I deal more with that, but then I've got the ability to talk to a networking person who wants BGP stuff done, and I don't necessarily initially know all the details, and then I move to a different thing. So sometimes it's me not knowing enough as well. So there's sort of all these random things. I generally have to go and find out what the people want, talk to a CCIE or a Juniper equivalent, get the facts, and then try and make it work. And a lot of it's, shoot at the stars and maybe hit the moon type of thing. So it evolves, and that takes time, I think. It's not always efficient, but to get a networking person to do coding, it's just as difficult as to get a person who's coding who's not got the same level of networking. So there's always a struggle between, do you want a programmer or do you want a networking guy? And that is a problem in itself, because you're trying to race against time to get something delivered, and you need to get the right resources in the room.
So maybe get one or two in here. So I've heard...
I wanted to just say, I think one thing we haven't said in one word is abstraction. I think when you do self-service, because what you're saying is people don't understand the network, we have to come up with abstracted ways for people to interact with the network and think about it from the business way.
It's a good idea. So I've heard my network's not standard enough, right? That was over here. I heard the services or products, if I can think about it that way, the products that I offer aren't standardized enough. So there's a Snowflake. Every time somebody wants network connectivity, it's a Snowflake. The Snowflake that's requested is on infrastructure that's not standardized. I heard the discussion is mostly focused on human problems and not a software development lifecycle, if I'm summarizing a bit. And then the question is, how do we build abstractions so that this problem goes away? That's what I've heard so far. Who else?
I guess again, ownership is another one as well. So as long as you keep the boundaries around who can do things and what, you can eliminate or mitigate some of the risk that might come in opening that up to a wider audience. So I think it's been mentioned a few times that you might have people who have enough knowledge, or you don't trust that have enough knowledge to use the tools properly. So maybe then it's a question of who's your customer, what you've got, what is the workflow we were describing earlier that might need to get done.
And I'll say it just for the mic. So it's trust in the people that are using it, and effective communication so they know what they're doing. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to sort of add on to that as well, is basically if you give people the ability to check out their own resources, they'll just check, some of them will just check out everything they possibly can in one request. So they may not necessarily request the appropriate amount of resource, be it size of VM, or they'll want public IP addresses for 13 things, and there's some people quite constrained resources.
And yeah, you're on the mic, so I don't need to repeat that. So if I summarized it, the people don't know exactly what they want. They might half order a service, and we don't know how to necessarily handle with that, right?
It's harder to pare back a service once it's been provisioned than it is to maybe add more to it later on.
Perfect. I think Mark had one, and then we'll move on maybe.
So the way I read the question is actually the other way around, right? Which is, why would the team not want to do this? And for me, it's all about repercussions. So I've sent out 100 tweets today, wasn't worried about it. Why do I always put my taxes off to the end of the year? It's because I'm going to screw something up and it's going to cost me money. And I think whenever you're interacting with any system, the chance of you failing in a way that you don't understand makes it less appetizing to start in the first place.
Fair enough. So I think we summarized everything. The ultimate question, I guess, is it our responsibility to put the guardrails in place with a set of standardized products against a standardized network so app developers can consume it? Or how do we get to that point? And I think as a group, that's a really to me, a very interesting challenge. We firefight, we deal with it. We can't just re-platform the whole network. I totally understand that. But the question is, what can we do incrementally to get more in that direction? Yeah. Good debate, thank you. I'm not sure if pinky in the brain translates, so. But we need to think big. I do think we are generally incremental, not calling for a revolution today, but you know, this is the group I think that can do something about it. I do think we need to think big, cloud operating models, self-consumable infrastructure. What do we need to do as a group to make that happen in whatever form? Cloud's just starting. We're still in early days. I used my AWS example earlier, but they're moving fast towards truly programmable infrastructure. I think we need to lean on our vendors to do the same. You know, putting an API in a controller is awesome. I love it. What does it take to make our network infrastructure programmable, truly programmable? I still think complexity is in the early days. When we talk about most of your environments, we used to talk about data center WAN campus, SD-WAN adoption's quite high, multi-cloud networking, your teams with multi-cloud, the stuff in between. Something that is a really awesome byproduct of the early days of SDN as we have transitioned from network infrastructure to software. And what that means is that there's more innovation happening, more networking products being driven by software without boxes and wires and chips. And because of that, I think you're going to continue to see the flywheel on that. So I think as a group, we need to plan for that, right? So I think the DevOps community has consolidated. I heard Puppet and Chef use today for the first time in a while. But I think we've really seen consolidation around Ansible, Terraform, and the Python stack, which is great because I think there's a common set of vernacular and tooling that we can use. But on the other side, we need to expect the complexity of the infrastructure we deal with to expand the other way. I love open source. I don't think we need to turn ourselves over to thinking that standards and open source will save us. There's a lot of stuff around standards. Abstractions was brought up. I'm happy to talk on break about Napalm, DevNet, all the different standards, communities, open bodies. I think this group can drive something forward. I don't think we can wait for other people to come do this for us. So I'm very interested in ideas and how we do that in whatever shape they take. And the shape of our problems continue to change. You know, when we look at data center fabrics, you know, people throw around cloth fabrics all the time. That's how we do it these days. I heard Abstra mentioned earlier. The shape of our problem continues to change. How do we build systems that are going to be flexible and not brittle to handle the shape of the problem continuing to change? Complexity increasing, shape of the problem increasing. Our users expect more, and app developers, I think, are at our door. So, NetDevOps, what is it? I'm not going to poll people, but I think we get a few different definitions. I think the most common definition I hear is applying DevOps principles to networking. That's if I did a secret ballot, I think that would be probably the highest percentage. But we have infrastructure as code. I haven't heard SRE used too much today, but really DevOps applied towards infrastructure and automations in support of application teams. Platform engineering, you know, IDP focuses of this self-serve. I think all of this collapses together into some manifestation of what this group can do towards NetDevOps. You know, kind of IAC is how we do our work. SRE is how we expose things to automation teams, and how we work internally is about platforms. I do think we're moving from tooling to platforms. I think most organizations, I mean, we talked about ServiceNow earlier. Nobody wants to automate with it, but we are replatforming IT on ServiceNow, I mean, by and large, right? And on the CRM sales side, you see replatforming on Salesforce. So the question is, how do we build platforms? And they can be whatever components you think they are. But if we think about them as platforms, and we think about offering our customers products through platform engineering, and we think of them self-serving through self-serve concepts and an IDP, I think the requirements that go on in our discussions raise the bar and require us to do more so that we can have that flywheel lifecycle be driven. So let me just check time. Can I get a time check? 10 minutes, perfect. So I threw these in there. These are my soapbox topics. So I would like debate on these if anybody finds one they find interesting. We talk about single source of truth in here. Super passionate that we have multiple sources of truth, so it's probably a little against the grain here. But we have a single source of truth for any data that we have, right? I think however we discuss source of truth, the negative ramifications of copying data is I think, the root of the issue, right? So the idea that the network is not programmable required us to build offline systems. These things are awesome. When I start to get programmable entities like AWS or an SD-WAN platform, if I start copying data from there, I need to make sure that nobody else is making changes through some other route. So I think as a group, the question is, how do we automate and orchestrate off the most current data possible with intended state driven in, right? So the question is, how do we do federation and how do we support a single source of truth for any particular piece of data we're talking about? I think I heard data transformations a few times today, so nobody's jumping in. I should just run through these, okay. Data transformation, these systems come back with complex payloads, right? So we have to challenge ourselves with how do we actually transform data. NetBox, ServiceNow, Infoblocks, et cetera, don't structure IPAM or IP addresses or resources the same, right? So when I'm in a system and I'm integrating, and we talked about using Ansible or any other automation tool, the question is, how do I transform data? Consuming APIs as an industry we've gotten really good at, the transforming of data dynamically without hard coding it in some Python scripts has been a challenge for us. So I think we need to come up with some models for how we do this. We need to get more comfortable with native API constructs. DSLs and YAML help us out, but as we go towards machine-based interfaces as a group, I think moving more towards the native API constructs without abstractions is going to be helpful. And we talked about IAC and platform engineering, so nobody's going to jump in. All right, so last slide. I think this group is crucial. I definitely would like us to challenge ourselves on how we think about doing what we do now. I'd like to think about how we can collaborate. Super appreciative for everybody coming, and obviously the hosts, and look forward to working through this stuff with everybody. So we'll go through questions.
We do have time for some questions. However, I'm missing my compadre. He's hiding there. Any questions?
Or comments.
Or observations, yeah.
There you go.
One down here in the front, one down.
Just a comment, really. You're saying that the forum's critical and this group needs to do something, and honestly, I couldn't agree more. I think if we can try and get some group action, some people working together, collaborating, pushing stuff forward, make a massive change. If we all go home now, go back to our respective places and wait to the next one, I don't know how much change we're going to affect.
Thank you.
There's one down here in the front.
Hello. So earlier on in your slide deck, you sort of showed this stepping through the maturity model.
Yep.
Given that we don't have infinite resources and infinite people, and there's always going to be sort of legacy things in our businesses that affect how we can transition through those models. Do you ever see a point where we don't stop the automation, but what we do is we settle sort of, right, we're at this point on an automation scale. To go here is too much of a stretch with the people and resources and everything we've got. And if that's the case, sort of, are there any telltale signs that you kind of get into limits of your journey? If it makes sense?
Maybe reframe.
So with a, say, like a four-man team, and say
okay.
Two people on that pushing forward the automation, four-man team, other two, say more traditionally in line with, they're not as forward pushing in that area. They're not as quick to come on board with these new ideas. I think you can only move through that maturity model so quickly.
Sure.
Do you see a point where, well, actually, without a large external change in type, like team makeup and everything like that, that you just sort of have to settle as a team that here is where we are on it, and should we? The temptation for us, well, personally for me, is like to always be pushing forward, change things. Is there a point where there should be a nice big red flag that actually, you know what, maybe we're at sort of the comfortable point on that journey for now, and it becomes a case of, is there something in sort of reiterating and reevaluating what we've done so far to make it, see if there's any gains to be made, rather than trying to sort of push for that next step onwards?
Yeah, I think how I'll answer that is, like, when we were talking with customers in the market, teams are at different stages, right? So we talk about networking, but there might be the route switch team, there might be the WAN team, load balancers, firewalls, et cetera, right? And people are at different stages. I think when you're discussing that, the question is how do we pick the right use cases that we can push as far to the right as possible? So different services, different portions of your network, and different teams will be at different speeds. The question is, how do we come up with a destination for the different teams, understanding that different networking technologies and domains are going to have different levels of complexity. I usually challenge people with something like DNS. You know, what, if you thought about it for a little bit, what would it take to offer, you know, a record creation to your app dev teams as an API? Something like that, because we tend to spiral into like the more complicated aspects. And I might need this, I might need that, but once we do that, I never have to process another a record request ever. Maybe they can delete them one day. I don't know.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yeah, I think you put your hand up first, sir.
It's not so much a question as maybe a topic for discussion, but do you feel like perhaps the real limiting factor for network automation is vendors not being particularly willing to commit to anything that is particularly standardized in the way that they allow you to communicate programmatically with their devices?
Ooh, love it. Yeah, this is a long discussion, so I'll do the short version, and then later we can talk about it. So that's why I kind of put the standards aren't going to save us in the instance, right? So if you look at, even MEF tried to standardize SD-WAN, participated in the early ODLs, which was an attempt to standardize the interfaces for our controllers. If you look at what service providers did with universal CPE and trying to coordinate CNFs and VNFs, they tried to make them, I don't know, differentiated in the marketplace. And then what happened, I'm just using SD-WAN as kind of an example here to try to make your point. But then the SD-WAN vendors made it super easy to consume, right? They went straight to the enterprise and said, here's the features of my SD-WAN. I'm going to save you money. We have all these features. And they didn't quite care to each other to drive any sort of abstraction, any sort of standards. And I also see this in the cloud with AWS and GCP and Azure. Try to tell them to all agree on something, right? So abstractions in certain areas, historically in the networking realm with Napalm, like a VLAN, super popular, very powerful, right? 3 or 4 vendors, they do them kind of similar. So I can build an abstraction. I like to say, you know, an orange and an apple I can turn into a fruit. But if it's an orange and a shoe, like, what am I going to do with this, right? So the question is how do we consume those APIs dynamically? How do I understand what they are, and how do I transform the data? And I think that's going to be the mindset that's going to drive this forward, especially when you look at the cloud providers. Abstractions on top, you know, when AWS launches 100 brand new services at reInvent, you know, are you going to wait for your abstraction vendor to build you an abstraction of that? Or is everybody banging on your door to use the newest feature to drive the business forward? So I don't think we can expect vendors to do that. I think they're differentiating in the marketplace because it's best for them. The question is, how do we work together to consume those dynamically? I personally love Swagger Spec. They all publish it now. I can dynamically consume it. It's great. Everybody should use it. But that, I think the mental model changes when we leave the data center and we leave the WAN, and these new challenges have to be taken into account as we think about how we're going to orchestrate. There's one more, unless you tell me no.
Squeeze it in.
We're saying probably we cannot expect the vendors to change that, but I don't know if you've heard of, at least the Google Cloud is integrating into the other cloud providers the hybrid connectivity product. So probably there, I don't know, hopefully there's something to
I don't work for Google, so I can't speak to what they're doing. I know they're making it easier to egress their traffic because they have fewer of the customers than the other two. But between Istio and some other things, I think there's some interesting standards going on there. I just don't think AWS is going to turn around and do what they say.
Thank you, Chris. Let's get another round of applause.